In August of 2024, inside a laboratory at Curtin University in Australia, a doctoral student named Anthony Clark stared at a set of numbers on his screen and felt something close to panic. He was not looking at rocks anymore. He was looking at zircon crystals, tiny mineral grains extracted from a broken fragment of stone that had been sitting at the center of Stonehenge for 5,000 years. For more than a century, every textbook, every museum plaque, every tour guide on Salisbury Plain had told the same story about this particular stone. It was called the altar stone. Everyone believed it came from Wales, just like the smaller bluestones around it, but the numbers on Clark's screen were not matching Wales at all. They were matching something 460 miles away, on the opposite end of Britain, in the old red sandstone basins of northeast Scotland. Clark would later say that he and his team could not believe what they were seeing. They ran the analysis again, same result. A 6-ton slab of rock, lying flat at the heart of the most studied monument on Earth, had been dragged, carried, or shipped across the entire length of the island, through forests, over mountains, possibly across open water, by people who had no wheels, no metal, and no written language. And the moment that finding became public, in the journal Nature, the entire foundation of what we thought we knew about Stonehenge began to crack open. Because if the builders of this place were capable of moving a 6-ton stone 750 kilometers, then everything we assumed about their limitations was wrong. And if we were wrong about that, what else were we wrong about? Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear rewrites almost everything you learned about this place in school. On England's Salisbury Plain, roughly 90 miles from London, a ring of stones has stood in an open field for thousands of years. From a distance, it looks simple, almost quiet, a circle sitting alone in the grass. Up close, it is anything but simple. The outer ring is made of sarsen stones, some standing more than 20 feet tall, each one weighing up to 25 tons. These were dragged from the Marlborough Downs, about 20 miles north. Inside that ring sits a second, smaller circle of bluestones, weighing up to 4 tons each, and these came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a staggering 140 miles away. And now at the very center, we know the altar stone traveled even farther than any of them, all the way from Scotland. Construction did not happen in a single burst. Archaeologists have traced the work across several distinct phases, beginning around 3000 BCE with a circular ditch and bank, then a ring of pits, and only later, the raising of the massive stones we recognize today, with major stone-setting phases continuing into roughly 2000 BCE. That means Stonehenge was a project that outlived generations. Grandparents who helped dig the first ditch never lived to see the sarsens raised, and here is the question that should stop you cold. How did people without metal tools, without the wheel, without any form of powered transport, move stones this heavy this far, and fit them together with joinery precise enough that modern engineers still study it? This is the point where Stonehenge stops being a pretty postcard image and starts looking almost impossible. For most of the last century, the accepted story was comforting in its simplicity. Neolithic farmers, driven by faith and community, spent generations hauling stones to build a religious center. Patient people, simple tools, collective effort, a monument to belief. That story is not false. But mounting evidence over the last 2 decades suggests it is dangerously incomplete. Because once researchers began treating Stonehenge not as an isolated monument, but as an interconnected system, cross-referencing centuries of surveys, geological sourcing studies, astronomical alignments, and landscape scans, a very different picture began to surface. Modern tools made this possible in a way that was never possible before. LIDAR scanning, which fires laser pulses at the ground to map subtle contours invisible to the naked eye, geophysical surveys that reveal buried structures without digging, and portable X-ray and isotope analysis that can trace a single rock fragment back to the exact quarry it came from. None of this required inventing anything new. It simply meant reading evidence that had been sitting in archives and fields for decades, but reading it together for the first time, as one connected story instead of dozens of separate footnotes. And what emerged was unsettling. The people who built Stonehenge were not simply pious laborers. They were something closer to engineers, astronomers, and long-distance logisticians, operating a project so ambitious that even now, with cranes and trucks and satellite mapping, we would think twice before attempting it. Start with the ring most people walk straight past without a second glance. Just inside Stonehenge's outer earthwork sits a circle of 56 pits, noted back in the 17th century by the antiquarian John Aubrey, whose name they still carry. Some of the Aubrey Holes contained cremated human remains. Others were empty. For decades, the uneven spacing between them was treated as evidence of primitive, imprecise digging, a forgivable flaw from people without proper measuring tools. But when researchers went back and measured the distances between all 56 pits with modern precision, the spacing did not look like error. It looked like rhythm. Plotted in sequence, the distances rise and fall in a pattern that echoes a cycle astronomers know well. the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle, the period over which the moon's rising and setting points drift to their extremes and slowly return. Multiply that cycle by 3 and you land at approximately 55.8, remarkably close to 56. Archaeologist Timothy Darville and others have proposed related calendrical functions for the site's numerology for years. And while the exact purpose of the Aubrey Holes remains debated among specialists, the possibility that this ring functioned as a long-term lunar tracking device, a place where priests or astronomers could stand and follow the moon's drifting cycle across decades, is taken seriously in current research. If true, this was not casual observation. This required someone, or several someones, watching the sky patiently for years, recording the moon's extremes, and then encoding that knowledge permanently into the Earth in a form that could outlive the people who built it. Now look at the stones themselves, and specifically at the smaller bluestones sitting inside the Great Sarsen Ring. But in the early 2010s, a research team from London's Royal College of Art, working with archaeologists from Bournemouth and Bristol universities, made a discovery that added a startling new layer to that theory, testing thousands of rocks across the Preseli landscape. In an area whose Welsh name literally translates to bell or ringing stones, they found that a strikingly high percentage of the local dolerite produced a clear, resonant, almost metallic tone when struck with a hammerstone, closer to a bell or a gong than an ordinary rock's dull thud. One nearby village had used these stones as literal church bells into the 18th century. When English Heritage granted the team rare permission to test the bluestones inside Stonehenge itself, several of them, despite being partially buried and dampened by the ground, still produced audible ringing tones. The implication is difficult to ignore. The builders may not have simply chosen the nearest available stone or the most sacred one. They may have selected rocks for how they sounded, effectively curating a set of lithophones, natural musical instruments, and then transporting an entire soundscape 140 miles to rebuild it at the center of their monument. Which raises an obvious and slightly unsettling question. What was Stonehenge built to sound like when it was struck, chanted in, or filled with drumming during a ceremony? That question becomes even more pointed when you place it beside what has been found in the ground itself. Cremated human remains have turned up across the site, concentrated especially around the Aubrey Holes, confirming that Stonehenge functioned for a time as a burial ground, quite possibly one of the largest cremation cemeteries in Neolithic Britain. But if this were simply a place for laying the dead to rest, the level of geometric precision, the astronomical alignments, the deliberate acoustic properties of the stones, none of that would be necessary. You do not need a resonant chamber to bury ashes. So researchers studying the interplay between the site's acoustic behavior and the placement of human remains have proposed something more layered, that this was not a passive graveyard but an active ritual environment, a space where sound, chanting, and the low-frequency reverberation of enclosed stone could have shaped the emotional and physical experience of the people standing inside it during funerary rites. Some researchers studying prehistoric acoustic spaces have raised the possibility that low-frequency sound in structures like this can be felt in the chest and skull, even when it is barely audible, altering heart rate and mood during ritual. Whether or not that specific mechanism applied at Stonehenge is still debated, but the broader idea that this was a place designed to be experienced, not just observed, has gained real traction among archaeologists studying prehistoric ceremonial spaces. There is also the question of how any of this stone actually got there. And the more closely researchers look, the more staggering the logistics appear. Experimental archaeologists have shown that a sarsen stone weighing 20 tons can, in principle, be dragged across timber rails or sledges by a coordinated team of people using ropes made from plant fiber, sometimes with the track greased using animal fat to reduce friction. That sounds almost simple, stated plainly, but it required not just muscle, it required rope making on an industrial scale, timber management, food, and shelter for the hundreds of workers involved in a single haul, and above all, coordination between communities who may have spoken different dialects and lived under different local customs. For the bluestones, some researchers have pointed to an intriguing possibility: a dismantled stone circle at Wan Mon in the Preseli Hills, whose pit sockets appear to match the diameter of Stonehenge's earliest earthwork and whose gap spacing lines up with at least one surviving bluestone. If that connection holds, it would suggest something remarkable: that an earlier monument in Wales was deliberately taken apart, and its stones carried east to be rebuilt at Stonehenge, as though the people involved were not just building something new, but relocating something they already considered sacred. Archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson, who has led much of this research, has proposed that this movement of stones may reflect a broader act of political and cultural unification. Communities from different regions of Neolithic Britain literally bringing pieces of their home landscapes to one central site, fusing them into a single monument that represented the island as a whole. The 2024 confirmation that the altar stone came from Scotland only strengthens that theory, since it means the monument's stones now trace back to Wales, to Scotland, and to the immediate Wiltshire area, an almost impossibly wide catchment for a single Neolithic structure. A team from University College London and Aberystwyth University argued in a 2024 paper that this pattern of long-distance stone gathering fits a monument designed to unite Britain's early farming communities. At a moment when shared pottery styles and livestock movements across the island suggest these groups were already growing more interconnected than previously assumed. That interconnectedness shows up in the food as clearly as it does in the stone. This tells us the monument was not a quiet, isolated shrine visited occasionally by local farmers. It was a periodic magnet for people and animals from across a huge stretch of the island, a recurring national event roughly 5,000 years before the idea of a nation would have meant anything in the modern sense. The astronomical alignments add yet another layer, and this is one area where even experts disagree sharply, which is itself revealing. It has long been established that the monument's main axis lines up with the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice, a relationship too precise to be accidental. In 2022, archaeologist Timothy Darville proposed a far more elaborate reading, arguing that the number and arrangement of the sarsen stones could function as a fully realized solar calendar, with the ring's 30 uprights representing days of a month, grouped in a system that, combined with intercalary days, tracks a 365-day solar year with remarkable accuracy. The theory generated enormous excitement and just as much pushback, with other specialists arguing the sarsen count required to make the calendar work is not securely established from the surviving stones and stone holes. That disagreement matters because it shows this is not a settled, tidy story handed down by consensus. It is a live argument playing out in academic journals about just how sophisticated Neolithic astronomical knowledge actually was. And every few years, new evidence tips that argument further away from the old assumption that these were simple people with simple aims. Zoom out from the stones entirely, and the picture gets bigger still, and this is where things become genuinely disorienting. Stonehenge was never alone. LIDAR surveys and geophysical mapping across Salisbury Plain have revealed that the monument sits inside a sprawling ceremonial landscape stretching for miles in every direction, containing earthwork enclosures, processional avenues, timber circles, and hundreds of burial mounds. The nearby Durrington Walls settlement, believed to have housed the workers who built Stonehenge, and the 2-mile-long Stonehenge Avenue connecting the monument to the River Avon, are just two pieces of a much larger, deliberately organized network. Some of these features align with each other across enormous distances in ways that are difficult to explain as coincidence, burial mounds positioned to form geometric relationships with the central circle, avenues running in straight lines toward specific points on the horizon where the sun rises or sets on the solstices. English Heritage and UNESCO both now formally recognize Stonehenge not as a standalone structure, but as the anchor point of an entire prehistoric landscape, a system where every earthwork and mound was placed in relation to a larger design. And crucially, dating evidence shows that some of these surrounding features, certain earthworks and burial mounds, predate the raising of the great sarsen stones, which means the monument we see today, the iconic circle photographed by millions of tourists every year, was not the starting point of this project. It may have been the final piece slotted into a plan that already existed. That single fact forces an uncomfortable question. If the overall layout existed before the central stones went up, then whoever conceived it was not building for their own lifetime. They were building for descendants they would never meet, executing a design that had to be preserved, taught, and transmitted with enough precision across generations that people, centuries later, could still complete it correctly. There is no surviving written language from Neolithic Britain, which means this knowledge, the astronomical timing, the sourcing of specific stones from specific quarries hundreds of miles apart, the geometric relationships across the landscape, had to survive entirely through memory, oral tradition, and whatever specialized class of ritual experts existed to carry it forward. That is an extraordinary act of cultural transmission, arguably more impressive than the physical construction itself. And here is where the story takes its strangest and most human turn. When archaeologists compare the precision of Stonehenge's earliest construction phases against its later ones, they find something that runs against the usual pattern of technological progress. Normally, a society building something ambitious gets better at it over time as it learns from experience. At Stonehenge, the opposite seems to happen. The earliest stone settings and alignments show remarkably tight precision. Later rearrangements, including stones that were pulled up, repositioned, or reset in subsequent phases, tend to show more deviation, less symmetry, joints and angles that do not quite match the confidence of the earlier work. Some sarsens bear multiple generations of tool marks, evidence that different builders, working perhaps centuries apart, returned to shape stones that earlier hands had already worked, sometimes in visibly different styles, as though later builders were trying to interpret and continue a design they had not originally created. Taken together, this pattern suggests something quietly haunting. The people who built Stonehenge's earliest, most precise elements understood something completely. A system of astronomical timing, acoustic tuning, and long-distance sourcing that later generations inherited only partially. They kept building. They kept maintaining the site for well over 1,000 years. But the full depth of the original knowledge appears to have thinned with each passing century, preserved in outline, while its finer logic slowly slipped away. Then, around 1600 BCE, activity at the site begins to decline sharply, and the way it ends is almost as strange as the way it began. This was not a sudden abandonment, the kind that follows famine, invasion, or disaster. Some stones were deliberately laid down rather than left standing to topple naturally. Certain areas show signs of intentional covering rather than simple neglect. It has the character less of a place being abandoned and more of a place being carefully closed, as though the people involved understood they could no longer sustain the system in full, but were unwilling to let it simply vanish. Official archaeology still describes Stonehenge cautiously and correctly as a prehistoric ceremonial and funerary landscape, a site whose exact purpose likely shifted across its many centuries of use, serving as burial ground, ritual center, and astronomical marker at different points in its long life. That caution is appropriate. Much of what has been outlined here remains actively debated among specialists, and no single theory, lunar calendar, acoustic temple, ancestral unification monument fully explains every detail on its own. But when you hold the real, published findings together, the Scottish origin of the altar stone confirmed in 2024, the lunar rhythm embedded in the Aubrey Holes, the deliberately musical stone selected from a resonant Welsh landscape, the vast, aligned network of earthworks stretching miles beyond the circle, and the slow fading of precision across generations, a picture emerges that is far stranger and far more human than the simple story of farmers stacking stones out of devotion. It suggests a society capable of extraordinary long-range coordination, moving stone across hundreds of miles of Neolithic Britain, tracking celestial cycles across decades, and choosing building materials for the emotional and physical effect their sound could produce on people standing inside a ring of them. It suggests knowledge that mattered enough to encode in the most durable material available, stone, precisely because oral memory alone could not be trusted to survive intact forever, and even that safeguard only partly worked. And it suggests, as the 2024 discovery so bluntly demonstrated, that we have consistently underestimated these people. For 100 years, scientists were certain the altar stone came from Wales. They were wrong by 750 kilometers. If we were that wrong about where a single stone came from, we should hold our confidence about everything else at Stonehenge a little more loosely too. It is worth sitting with just how disruptive the altar stone finding really was to the field, because for over a century it was not treated as an open question. Since the early 1920s, the assumption that the altar stone belonged to the same Welsh sandstone family as some of the bluestones was treated as settled background fact, repeated in guidebooks, documentaries, and academic papers without serious challenge. It took a study published in 2023 to first show that the stone's mineral composition simply did not match any known Welsh source, which quietly reopened a mystery that most specialists thought had been closed for 100 years. Only then, using detrital zircon, apatite, and rutile grains, tiny minerals whose age and chemical signature act almost like a fingerprint for the rock they came from, did the Curtin University team trace the altar stone to the Orcadian Basin of northeast Scotland. Susan Graney, an archaeologist at the University of Exeter who was not involved in the study, said plainly that it was a surprise the stone had traveled so far. No other stone used in any Neolithic monument anywhere in Britain is known to have traveled a comparable distance. Researchers still cannot say for certain whether it moved overland, through forests and hills with no roads, or by sea along a coastline exposed to open water, and they admit they cannot yet explain why a community would go to such extraordinary lengths for one single stone, rather than sourcing something closer. That unanswered why is exactly the kind of gap that keeps this story from ever feeling finished. The real story of Stonehenge may not be a mystery of who built it, since we know reasonably well that it was Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities across many generations. The deeper mystery is what those communities knew, how completely they understood the sky, the acoustics, and the logistics of moving mountains of stone across an island with nothing but rope, timber, and coordinated human effort, and how much of that understanding had already begun slipping away by the time the last stone was set. Every new study seems to strip away a little more of the comfortable, simplified version of this place and replace it with something more ambitious and considerably more unsettling, a monument built not just to worship or to bury the dead, but to hold on to knowledge its own builders may have sensed they were at risk of losing. 5,000 years later, we are still trying to read what they left behind, piece by piece, stone by stone, and the more precisely we look, the less it resembles a simple circle of rocks on a quiet English field. And there is one more detail worth leaving you with, because it captures the whole strange feeling of this place better than anything else. Stand at the center of Stonehenge today, and you are standing on ground that connects to at least 3 separate corners of ancient Britain at once. Wiltshire beneath your feet, Wales through the bluestones circling around you, and Scotland through the single flat slab lying at the heart of it all. No other prehistoric structure in Europe pulls together materials from such a wide radius, and no comparable feat of long-distance stone transport shows up anywhere else on the island until long after Stonehenge was already ancient. That alone should change how you picture the people who built it. Not isolated farmers hauling rocks out of blind devotion, but a network of communities, separated by hundreds of miles of forest, river, and coastline, somehow coordinated enough to plan, source, move, and assemble a single unified monument over the course of many centuries, using nothing but memory, muscle, rope, and timber to do it. Every fresh discovery seems to shrink the gap between what we assumed they could do and what they actually did, and each time that gap shrinks, the monument gets a little harder to explain away as simple. 5,000 years on, we're still finding out how much we underestimated them. One stone, one pit, one buried alignment at a time. If you found this as unsettling as we did putting it together, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss what we uncover next.